live stream, but anything is possible. It may not be live. We are waiting. Close. Looks like you're ready. Go live. Okay. Here we go. All right. We are live with Sir Roger Penrose and with Stuart Hameroff joining us from various locations around the world. And hopefully everyone out there will enjoy this wide-ranging conversation on consciousness, the brain, quantum mechanics, and controversy, or controversy as we say. And that has to do with some recent developments, both experimentally and in the world of the theory basis for what is called Orch-OR, which we'll talk about. But first, a very important announcement. I want to wish a happy 91st birthday to Sir Roger Penrose. Roger, how does it feel to be 91, to reach midlife?
I'm not sure I am yet, am I? What's the date?
Well, I think it's the 5th of August.
No, I've got 3 days to go. So
3 days. Okay, so 3 days of being the 90, only 90, yes. But you're in the 91st year.
That's correct, yes.
And Stuart, you are joining us from where?
Banff in Canada, where I've been attending a workshop related to the experiments we did from a Templeton grant to test Orch-OR, looking at quantum effects in microtubules. And Roger zoomed in all week and gave an excellent talk also.
That's fantastic. And there's been a lot of news. And Stuart, I've meant to have you on for a long time. And this is kind of a special treat to have both of you guys on at the same time. And really the occasion is this dramatically kind of progressing field of consciousness. In fact, just last week, Roger, your ears were probably burning because we had a live webinar with some friends in the UK and around the world that I hosted for the Institute for Art and Ideas. And the question was about reality and the role that quantum mechanics plays. And quite frequently, we invoked your name. In fact, we said many times, we asked Eric Weinstein, Sabina Hassenfelder, Carlo Rovelli, all PhD theoretical physicists. We asked them to comment on your comment, as you have said in the past, that consciousness reeks of something quantum mechanical. So I want to ask you, Roger, first of all, how, when you think about the role of quantum mechanics that you learned from Dirac and that you taught, at least to me, the first time in The Emperor's New Mind 30 plus years ago, how has your thinking evolved on quantum mechanics and its role in consciousness, if at all?
Well, there is an important development which has happened, I guess. I mean, a lot of things are very similar to what I thought in The Emperor's New Mind, the ideas I put forward there. And I should point out, you see, people often regard it as very revolutionary or something, that quantum mechanics could be involved in consciousness. But the point is that my view is that it's even worse than that, in that it's not quantum mechanics being involved, it's where quantum mechanics is incomplete or even not quite correct. Because quantum mechanics has a big puzzle right at its roots. And some people kind of resolve this by invoking consciousness in the sort of opposite way that I do. You see, the question is, there's a thing called the Schrödinger equation, which tells you how the quantum state evolves in time. And this is an equation which is very deterministic, just like Newtonian mechanics and that sort of thing. So if you know what the state is now, it will tell you what the state will be in 15 minutes from now, and so on. The only trouble is that it doesn't, because it only tells you what the quantum state is, and the quantum state, you make measurements in order to find out what the thing tells you. And to make a measurement, you have to involve something else that's not part of the system. You sort of wheel the measuring device out of the cupboard and get it to measure the state, and then you wheel it back into the cupboard again. And the trouble is that if you were consistent, you'd have to consider that that machine you just wheeled out of the cupboard is also following the Schrödinger equation. And if you do that, you get nonsense. You don't get one answer to your questions. You get what's called a superposition of different alternative answers. If you want to get one answer, you've got to do standard quantum mechanics, what's called making a measurement. And what's called making a measurement involves violating the Schrödinger equation. Now, Schrödinger was absolutely clear on this. He was one of the people who was completely clear. And that's why he considered this thought experiment of a cat in a box. And you put this cat into a superposition of being dead and alive. And Schrödinger would say, look, this is ridiculous. You couldn't have a cat that's dead and alive. But lots of people say, oh, we'll have to try and make a machine which actually makes a cat dead and alive. What Schrödinger was pointing out, that quantum mechanics as understood, in other words, following his equation, gives you nonsense. It tells you that you have cats that are dead and alive at the same time. Now, some people would take the view, they did in the early days of quantum mechanics, that you need a conscious observer to come along, and it's the conscious observer who looks at the quantum state, and that makes it be one thing or another rather than both things at once. Now, that's ridiculous in a way, and I don't want to go into why it's ridiculous, but it was very strongly held by quite a lot of very distinguished physicists at the time. Now, the view I hold is almost the opposite of that. It is that the state does reduce itself. That is to say, the cat becomes either dead or alive spontaneously, not because anybody looks at it or even the cat looking at itself, but because this superposition is too big in a certain sense, and that it spontaneously becomes one or the other. And it does this with something much, much smaller than the size of a cat. It's a very tiny effect which could make it become one or the other. And this involves, in my view, bringing the general theory of relativity in. This is Einstein's theory of gravity, curved space-time, and all that sort of thing. And when you bring this into quantum mechanics, you find that you have a conundrum. And the way of resolving this conundrum is to say that instead of having these superpositions of two things at once, there was a certain lifetime of that superposition. And the bigger the superposition is, the shorter the lifetime is. So if it was a cat dead or alive, it would be virtually instantaneous. But you could have something very much, much smaller than that, and it becomes one or the other in a time that you can calculate. And the idea that Stuart and I have been trying to develop is that in the brain, or primarily in things like microtubules or big collections of microtubules probably, that's where one thing or the other thing happens. And the process of one thing or the other thing happening, well, that's what we refer to as proto-consciousness. Proto-consciousness is sort of the building block out of which consciousness is built. So the reduction of the state, as I say, the quantum state choosing one or the other rather than both at once, that process is something outside standard quantum mechanics, but it's something which you can make predictions about if you bring Einstein's general theory of relativity into the picture. And it gives you a time scale for how long the superposition can exist before one or the other happens. The claim we make is that each time this choice of whether one thing or the other happens, that's what we call proto-consciousness. And as I say, it's the building block out of which actual consciousness, which involves many, many of such processes, actual consciousness comes about. So that's a sort of summary of our point of view, except in detail what's going on, which is Stuart has much better ideas about that than I do. So.
Right. Yeah. So, and Stuart, the conference that you've been at involves some kind of orchestration as well, because you've been talking about how we can identify experimentally where consciousness might take place. And I wonder if you could kind of give a slight overview, maybe a recap for the audience that might not be as familiar as I am. But I said in a tweet I put out, that Sir Roger's book, The Emperor's New Mind, really influenced me. It was the first popular science book I ever read as a 15-year-old. And then I was tickled when he endorsed my book, Losing the Nobel Prize, my first book, which allowed him still to go on and win the Nobel Prize a few years later, despite his association with yours truly. But he said, he was disappointed in that book because at the end, he kind of speculates, and he was hoping that he'd get some fresh young people and with new ideas, et cetera. And he got, well, you were young. I mean, you're not that old now, so you couldn't have been that old 30 years ago.
It was an exception. These were mainly the old retired people who got hold of me. There were a few younger people, and Stuart was one of the younger people.
So what jumped out at you about that book that caused you to take the risk and start this relationship with Roger that's persisted for the last 30 plus years?
Right. Well, I had at that point in the early 90s when I read it, been studying microtubules inside cells and particularly inside brain neurons. I got interested in microtubules in medical school and studying mitosis in a cancer lab, where these mitotic spindles, which are microtubules, pull apart the chromosomes in a very highly orchestrated dance to get exact separation, duplicate pairs of chromosomes that go on to each becomes the daughter cell. And if that isn't perfect, then you can get a cancer, you can get maldevelopment, and so forth. And so everybody else in the lab got really interested in the chromosomes, being the dawn of the genetic revolution and so forth in the early 70s. But for some reason, I got fascinated with these structures, which seemed to know where to go and what to do. It seemed to have some kind of intelligence. And I had been interested in consciousness from my undergraduate days. And so I wondered whether these structures, which turned out to be microtubules, might be processing information. And I was primarily interested in the brain and uh, thought that they might support processes inside neurons leading to consciousness. Because if you think about the neuron as a simple on off switch, as most people do, the brain is a complex computer of simple neurons, then you treat each neuron as a one or a zero. But actually, if you think of a single cell organism like a paramecium, it swims around, it finds food, it finds a mate, it has sex, it can learn. It's very clever. I'm not saying it's conscious necessarily, although it might be, but it has intelligence and it uses its microtubules. So at that time, the structure of microtubules was discovered to be a lattice, a cylindrical lattice with, in some cases, Fibonacci geometry. And I spent a number of years looking at information processing models in microtubules as basically molecular scale computers, which increase the information capacity inside neurons tremendously. About 1 billion tubulins switching at 10 megahertz gave you 10 to the 16th operations per second per neuron, whereas neural net people, AI people, the singularity people were saying, no, there were 10 to the 16th operations per second in the entire brain. And when that was met, we have brain equivalence and consciousness. And I was going around being a pain in the rear end to AI people saying, no, your target's way, way downstream. You're being naive and insulting the neuron by saying it's a one or a zero. And they would say things like, go away, kid, you bother me. What do you know? But then one day somebody said something very, very important and profound to me. He said, let's say you're right. How would that explain consciousness? You have all this information processing at a deeper level, and you have 10 to the 27th instead of 10 to the 16th operations per second. How would that explain feelings, love, joy, emotion, the color pink? And I had to admit, I didn't know. And I was a bit stunned to be categorized as a reductionist, but that's what I was. But fortunately, that person suggested I read Roger's book, The Emperor's New Mind, which I did. And I was really fascinated and blown away by it. The bottom line being that he had a mechanism for consciousness and nobody else did. Before everybody else, or even still today, kind of hand waving arguments about complexity, emergence. Maybe it's fundamental, maybe it's panpsychism, but who knows? But he had a specific mechanism, which at the time I didn't understand and still don't completely understand, but I've certainly studied and pondered it for many years. And so I thought, in the end of his book, he said, well, we need a quantum computer in the brain that will collapse by his OR mechanism. And he mentioned that, neurons, axons firing and not firing, that superposition was too large scale, and I agreed. And I wrote to him and I told him about microtubules and that they might be the quantum computer collapsing by his objective reduction that he was looking for. And he agreed enough so that we met in his office. I happened to be going to England, and I told him about microtubules, and he appreciated it very much. And that started our collaboration.
And when, most people think about quantum mechanics, and I said, I love you guys, and and you've all been generous with your time and conversing with the public. But today's not just purely a love fest, because we just found out it's not Roger's actual birthday. So we can ask, does the emperor have clothes? And what is the most common objection, Sir Roger? What do people say? I know what I think as an objection, but I'm not as erudite in this field as most people. What's the most common objection, and what do you think is the best objection to Orch-OR, if any?
Well, maybe the best objection was my own objection at the time, which was when I wrote The Emperor's New Mind. I could see no way. I tried to learn about nerve propagation, and I learned about the Hodgkin-Huxley problem, and all this kind of stuff, which is the official way in which signals were sent around the brain. And I thought there's no hope. You see, I thought by the time I learned these things, I would finish off my book with a great dash and say, this is how you explain consciousness. And I couldn't. It just didn't make any sense to me. And so I kind of petered off with not really knowing what I was doing. And then I got this letter from this unknown person to me, Stuart Hameroff. I get lots of crazy letters from people who say, is this another crazy letter? What are these tiny little tubes he's talking about? I've never heard of them before. And then I look them up and I found, God, my gosh, he's right. And so I communicated with him and we got together. And this was the first time I could see a route to something where you could possibly, you see, what you need in order for this kind of scheme to work, you need some isolation, so you can get your quantum degrees of freedom don't get sort of spread out through the brain as it would be. If it was just nerve propagation, then there are these electromagnetic fields which spread out and they simply do what's called decohere, and you just lose everything. So you need something which has the hope of preserving these degrees of freedom, these quantum mechanical degrees of freedom. And the microtubules looked to me the best thing I'd ever seen as a possibility for doing this. I think we still have to work hard to and I think they're not any old microtubules, that they have to be organized right, and they have to do something like, I knew various things about the brain. For example, that the cerebellum, which has, well, as I now know, more neurons in it than the cerebrum. I didn't know at the time. I think they didn't have the numbers right then, but I certainly they were comparable. Whereas the cerebrum, where our sort of conscious thoughts seem to be connected with, the cerebellum, it seems to be pretty well unconscious. Yet it's got all these neurons, and why are they not being conscious?
Right.
Stuart comes up with now what I think is a much better understanding of what the difference could be, and that is these cells called pyramidal cells, which are simply not present in the cerebellum. And this is the first time I've heard of something where you see a key difference and where the cerebellum doesn't have these things, and that would explain why it's not conscious.
And typically, when I see people objecting to Orch-OR, et cetera, it's the objection that, well, quantum mechanical effects, don't take place at room temperature, inside of squishy, wet environments, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder, Stuart, what objections? And you're not a quantum physicist. You're not a physicist at all. You're an anesthesiologist with a deep and abiding interest and fascination in these topics. But the question I have, is how was it a solution in search of a problem? In other words, could it have been any other cell? What is unique about microtubules, and how can they persist, not decohere at room temperature inside a wet, squishy environment?
Right. Everybody said, well, obviously the brain is too warm, wet, and noisy for delicate quantum effects. They would decohere. But the brain is not a homogeneous monolithic material. The brain is highly heterogeneous, and this occurs in various ways, different anatomical reasons, as Roger just said. But as an anesthesiologist or a pharmacologist, and we're kind of applied pharmacologists, we think about where drugs go and how they act. And the body, the brain, has different compartments of solubility. So, for example, most drugs that you either take in a pill or IV, IM, however you take it, wind up binding in an area that fits their solubility. So most drugs are polar. That is, they have charges, they are soluble in water, and they bind to charged receptors usually on the surface of cells. Anesthetics are completely different. They are nonpolar. They are hydrophobic. They go to places where water doesn't go. It's oil and water don't mix, okay? So that's basically the idea. And there's a pretty good percentage of the brain and body in general that is nonpolar, that is hydrophobic, that is comprised largely of, for example, aromatic rings like benzene, which is, gasoline if it's in bulk form, but in individual molecules, it can have very delicate quantum effects. And all the psychoactive molecules, serotonin, dopamine, the psychedelics are composed of these aromatic rings, which have pi electron resonance states. So, and these pi electron resonance states, they fluoresce, they luminesce, they do all kinds of things that are basically quantum optical effects. And the anesthetics, and they tend to, these amino acids that have these rings tend to coalesce inside proteins, and that's where the anesthetics go. They bind in these nonpolar hydrophobic regions, which we've come to call the quantum underground, by the way, because that's where the quantum stuff happens. It forms a decoherence-free subspace with limited degrees of freedom that is very conducive to quantum effects. And in fact, we've shown this. And so that's where the anesthetics go, and they bind only by very weak quantum forces. So you have molecules that are otherwise inert. Even the inert gas xenon is an anesthetic that goes to these places in the brain that have these nonpolar pi resonance rings, and they, in fact, they bind all over the body in fat stores. There's more anesthetic in a patient's rear end than in their brain, but obviously it works in the brain. Just like there's a lot of anesthetic in the membranes and lipids in the brain or the fat around the body, but that's not where they work. All they do primarily is affect consciousness. They have very, very few other side effects. They're fairly selective and specific.
And these are ubiquitous, right, Stuart? These exist in all animals, so.
Microtubule, yes.
All brains, right. Mm-hmm.
But they're arranged in a particular way in the pyramidal cells that I'll come back to. But so there's this hydrophobic region. And the anesthetics bind by quantum forces, Van der Waals forces. So you have this strange situation where these molecules go all over the body and bind by these quantum forces everywhere, and yet all they do is affect consciousness. And what that says to me is that consciousness involves highly organized, highly coordinated, orchestrated, delicate quantum processes that are easily interrupted. If the anesthetics go into the fat of somebody's fat store somewhere, there's no organized quantum stuff going on, so there's no effect. So it suggests that consciousness depends on highly organized, orchestrated quantum effects. And in fact, that's what we've been talking about all week at this conference, because we got funded from Templeton, as I said, and we've been doing experiments in 2 different labs looking at quantum optical effects in microtubules and then showing that those effects go away with anesthesia.
Mm. And Roger, this quantum object, you said you were surprised that these microtubules existed and they seem to be designed. When I think about quantum mechanics, typically, yes, there are collapsing wave functions, there are superposition states, but do you think we can even have a theory of consciousness that is quantum mechanical before we solve something like the measurement problem, or do you think that is not necessary as a precondition?
I would think it's the wrong way around. That is to say, I think that we're not going to, put it like this, I don't think we're going to have a theory of consciousness until we have a theory of state reduction. That is the collapse of the wave function, or the whatever you call it. Whether we will have one then, I don't know. But I think that's another step, you see. We still don't understand why or how the wave function collapses in any detail. I mean, there are schemes about this, and one of these is my own, but lots of people have different views on this. It's certainly, and lots of people don't even believe it, you see. Lots of people haven't thought it through. They think somehow you don't need a new theory in quantum mechanics. I don't quite know why they ignore the collapse of the wave. It's called collapse of the wave function. You know, the wave function is supposed to chug along according to the Schrödinger equation, then suddenly it collapses. And this was known right from the beginning. I mean, Schrödinger, with his introduction of this theoretical story about the cat. So he was obviously very worried about that phenomenon. So it's there. But people were very fuzzy about this kind of thing.
Stuart, are you still there? We seem to have lost our guests for some reason. Let's see if we can bring them back in. That is very strange. Let's see here if I can figure out what is going on. Yeah, it is strange. They just disappeared. Hopefully they'll come back on and we will regain consciousness in the stream, because what I'm really hoping to do is to get a distinction. We heard Sir Roger just talking about collapse of the wave function. There are theories that don't involve collapsing wave functions, such as Everettian many worlds interpretations. And so I want to also engage with them on this as well, to see if there's a possibility for them to address the role of microtubules and so forth in a many worlds interpretation sense. And it may be that they do not subscribe to that, so they won't be able to really have as much to say about such a thing. But as I say, let me try to ping them back again, if this will work. I don't know where they have went. They just kind of up and died. Let me see here. And I'll send an email to Roger. Hopefully I don't have to start this again, because that might get rid of the stream as well. Let's see if this works. Stuart, I see you on Zoom. And I see an iPhone on Zoom. Here, click that link. I don't know what happened. Both of you guys are lost. You nod up and down, Stuart, if you can hear me. Let's try this again. I'm going to try it myself. Bear with me. Hello. Try it. Yes. This is annoying. Okay, I am going to switch to another live stream on Ecamm. Stuart, can you see me or no? Stuart, do you hear me? Oh, I don't have my thing joined. Stuart, do you hear me or see me? No, I can't hear you. Hold on a second. All right, I'm going to stop the stream and we're going to switch over to another. Stuart, you hear me? Do you have Roger's number to ask him just to try one more time and then, or yeah, both of you guys just got kicked off. I'm going to go over to, I'm going to just stay on Zoom and we'll just do it live on Zoom. But do you have a phone number to reach him or? Okay, let me, I'm going to quit this. All right, everybody. So join us over on the YouTube channel. We'll make this a 2-part episode. I don't know why this is not working. But join us in just a bit on the YouTube channel, Dr. Brian Keating.